The Last of His Name by E.S. Stephens. Narrated by E.S. Stephens. Music by Asha Falero. The battle could be heard through the window, though it was miles to the front line. It came on the wind as it howled across the fangs, bringing the winter's snow like dancing ghosts in the courtyard. Snow was rare to any of the Droragar, but here, with the mountains rising before them, it was not unknown. Soon the old keep was covered in a dusting of white like something out of a nursery tale. It drifted high onto the tower, where the ravens slept and shoved against the old wooden gates, making them rattle. Was it snowing there too? Vethlet caught himself thinking of the battlefield where the Drow and the Dwentari forces collided. For a moment he considered checking if his father had packed his winter cloak. He strangled the thought before it could gain strength. What would he do if he hadn't? Take it to him? Send a runner through the pass in this weather? A frightened boy worrying that his father might catch a chill? Certainly not. He was not a child. Of that his father had been most clear. You are my son. It will be your duty to act as steward while I am gone. The old Drow's voice echoed in his head. Oh, how Vethlet had chafed at that role. He was not so young that he could not wield a blade or ride a horse. He had led the garrison against the dark creatures that made their way down the slopes from time to time. Their blood was no different to any Dwentar he imagined. Yet when the summons came, when the brewing war between the two nations finally broke, his father would brook no argument. Shall we sledge down the slopes in it tomorrow, Veth? Vethlet started, unaware that anyone had entered the chamber. His half-brother, Niran, stood there, hands behind his back, in a parody of his older brother. Still a boy, Niran only just reached Vethlet's shoulder, and idolized his sibling, much to Vethlet's irritation. No, Niran, the foothills are not safe enough. What would your mother say if I brought you back with a Dwentari arrow in your back? Vethlet replied, and turned his face back to the window. Niran sulked and crossed his arms. You used to be more fun. I was not steward of Keep Doverin back then, Vethlet added, ignoring the bitterness he felt at saying the words. You're not that much older than me, Niran pushed. Vethlet smiled a fraction. It is enough. Niran sighed and pushed Vethlet to get a better view, insisting on using the same window despite the number of others available. Vethlet hissed his irritation, but stepped back to allow his brother some space. The front line is getting closer. You can hear it now. Niran pushed his slightly pointed ear to the crystal of the window. I don't hear anything. That's because you're louder than a wyvern in mating season, Vethlet scoffed. I am not, Niran retorted. You didn't even hear me come in. I saw you jump. The youngster waited for the expected denial. Admit it. Vethlet shrugged. Go away, Niran. He looked away and focused on the view. When Niran didn't leave, he turned and snarled, I said go away. Now it was the boy's turn to startle. He leapt away from his brother as if stung by a hornet, and broke for the door, slamming it loudly. Silence resumed. Night fell. Snow deepened. The keep was not bereft of soldiers. Not all the men had left with Steward Doverin. Young Drow, too junior or untried, huddled around the last glowing cinders of a brazier on the far side of the barracks, shoulder to shoulder for warmth. The rattle of dice echoed across the room. A hero's song pounded in their hearts, but the thunder of a cavalry charge, the sharp ring of tempered steel, and the scent of blood were not to be theirs, and the cold had chewed away the edges of their resolve. They had been ordered to defend the keep, and when the time came, to tend their wounded comrades when the battle ended. They would be the last line of defence, should the forward attack fail and the Dwentari take the pass. In truth, were such a terrible event come to be, there would be too few of them to halt the advance, and the Dwentari would fall upon the Emberfeld plains like a flood. But it had been weeks now since the cavalry column had left the keep, with 300 men at its back, and the mere 100 remaining had heard nothing of what was going on out there beyond the peaks. Vethled entered. A blast of air accompanied him, setting the candles to flicker. A handful of soldiers looked up. Less saluted. Vethled did not cut the imposing figure of his father, and though his stewardship was ratified, many had yet to grow accustomed to the idea. The barrack house was separated from the main keep. A stone-wood building attached to the outer wall. Vethled adjusted his scale armour uncomfortably as he passed along the rows of empty bunks. He itched with a desire to say something inspiring, do something even, despite the late hour. Moments passed, and a few times he was asked if he cared to roll. He politely declined. There was no need to take their money, even if they would have happily taken his. A few more minutes, and they had forgotten he was even there. Vethled headed to the rickety ladder that led up to a low hatch in the roof. Pulling himself up, he pushed the latch open and braced himself against the cold wind once more before attempting to ease himself through. His foot skidded on the rung. A mailed hand grabbed the fur scruff of his cloak before he could fall back. Vethled looked up into the helmeted face of a grizzled droll. Mordriver had been the drill sergeant at the keep for as long as he could remember. It was rumoured that even his father had studied the sword in his care. Most would have retired from the post, but not Mordriver. He had been raised in the keep and helped raise many others, and he would die here, whether that be in battle or simply by the steady toll of time. Behind the bars of the helmet, his face was pinched against the cold, and the horsehair tail atop it whipped in the wind. With a strength that never ceased to surprise Vethled, he hoisted the young steward up onto the wall. "It is a murderous night, my young sir," he grunted, his voice sounding like cracking bones. "You've picked a bad one to come and wander." Vethled pushed away, and holding an arm to his eyes, gingerly inched to the scalloped edge of the wall, peering into the night. Even in the day, there hadn't been much to see, and Vethled seriously doubted that any battle could be fought in such horrendous conditions. Mordriver stood next to him, a silent sentinel. The snow collected on his shoulders, but he did not move. "I could hear the battle on the winds," Vethled spoke at last, once the silence had become intolerable. "It is an old battle," Mordriver announced. "The winds carry its echoes across the peaks." "How can you be sure?" Vethled looked up at the old soldier, and thought he caught a grin. "Time," Mordriver replied. "You live long enough at the moor of a god, you learn that her whispers are telling you something." Vethled squinted into the dark, but shook his head. "I can't see anything at all." "It's rare, but the snow's coming down this hard, even here," Mordriver admitted, "but it will pass by morning." Vethled stood, listened to the roar of the wind. The song of battle appeared to have slowed. If it was an echo, as Mordriver claimed, had the battle concluded? No, there was something else out there now, something thundering and muffled by the snow. The sound reminded him of heavy wooden poles beating the earth. It took a moment for him to realize what it was. Running to the far side of the wall, Vethled would have almost thrown himself into the courtyard below, were it not once again for Mordrever's arresting hand. "Open the gate!" he screamed down to the two soldiers huddling in the shadow of the small gatehouse. "Riders!" he called once again. "Open the gate!" The heavy-built horse burst through the driving snow and thundered through the gates that had barely opened wide enough for it to pass. The door of the main keep flew wide, filling the courtyard with golden light. Niren took the outside steps 2 at a time, dressed in just a simple jerkin despite the protestations of his mother within. Bethled pressed himself against the inner parapet of the wall, eager to get a glimpse. A pair of warriors jostled and tumbled from the back of the steed. Niren fell back with a yell at the tangle of limbs and blades coming toward him, struggling, grappling, until with a kick one of them rolled away. He was short, his mouth askew in the half-shattered helm upon his head. Braided hair, thick as a bear's, appeared to bristle from every conceivable pore. Bethled couldn't say for certain if it was man or beast. In the warm glow of the keep he glimpsed blood beneath the broken patchwork of its insectoid armour. Its combatant stood, wrenching the barred helm from its head and dashing it into the snow. A human face, the nose broken and blooded, with a gash sliced from brow to chin. The man limped haltingly towards his opponent, the wind snagging the ragged tatters of his cloak away from him as he raised a heavy blade and forced it through the shoulder of the creature he had brought within the walls. Its head lolled, and the body slumped as the human removed the blade and looked up at the faces staring curiously at him. He stumbled, winced, then looking down at the hatchet buried in his side with a mixture of pain and surprise, collapsed in the snow. "Well, don't just stand there," Mordrever roared at the bewildered soldiers. "Get me a gurney and get him inside." The soldiers leapt to attention. Within minutes, a stretcher was brought from the keep, and their new guest gently brought within the barracks. The hatchet was removed, and the wound wadded. Though the keep possessed no healers, Mordrever saw to his wounds as best any soldier could with a field kit. When he could do no more, he stood up and wiped his brow with a clean cloth. "He's in the hands of Erith now. If he lives, we can send a fast horse to the village for a healer." Bethled had not seen that many humans before. He knew that some of the noble houses used them as hired mercenaries, but was unaware that any had been brought this far south. "He looks almost as feral as the other one," Niren muttered, having forced his way forward to Gork. Bethled kicked him in the leg, but he couldn't take his eyes off the visitor either. He had tanned, rough skin that had begun to turn blue, with the cold, wide lips and a rounded face. Suddenly, his eyes snapped open, and he reared up despite his wounds, reaching for a weapon that was no longer there and roaring. The human pounced at the nearest drow soldier, yanking at the armour and clawing at their face. He wrenched for the sword at the soldier's waist before he could be restrained by Mordrever and the others. "Must be the war song that's got him," Mordrever snorted. The human's dull eyes shifted around the room. His gaze slowly slid over Bethled and Niren. "I am steward of Keep Doverin," Bethled managed, taking an involuntary step back. The human panted, grunted, and stared at him. Bethled placed a protective hand on Niren's shoulder and tried to tell himself that the human wouldn't hurt them. He fought for the Drowagar, even if he did not call King Versil liege as they did. His loyalty may have been bought with coin, but he fought them all the same, didn't he? Even if he was clearly utterly mad. A line of spittle dripped from the stubble of the human's chin as he wrestled against those that held him in place. His lips curled away from his teeth in a snarl, or maybe a smile. He forced himself forward, one lurching step towards them, a growl forming in the back of his throat before being hit with the pommel of a blade and crumpling to the floor unconscious. "We should lock him up beneath the keep," Mordriver sniffed. "Maybe the peace will bleed some of the wrath from him." Vethled nodded, his heart thumping in his chest as he watched 3 soldiers drag the prone form back out into the snow. He looked down at Niren and relinquished his grip, where he had been clawing his fingers into the boy's shoulder. Niren had his hands over his mouth and nose as he looked up at him. "Cover your face," he whispered. "What?" Vethled looked at him in concern. "Why?" "Parasites. Humans are filthy with them. Didn't you know?" Niren replied, muffled, his eyes deadly serious. "What?" Vethled asked, confused, and looking around at the dispersing soldiers. "They wriggle into your head and turn you mad," Niren replied. "That's a myth, Niren. You can't catch anything off the human. Well, at least you aren't going to catch that." Vethled rolled his eyes. Cautiously, Niren removed his hands and took in a halting breath before immediately replacing them. "That doesn't mean he smells any better." Vethled turned back to Mordriver, wiping the blood off his hands with a cloth. "Do you suppose he's come all the way from the front?" "Most likely," Mordriver replied. "A deserter, maybe. The humans don't have the stomach for it like us. They talk a good talk, but in the end their lives are like cheap candles, bright but short. So they value each day like it was their last. They have a very strong sense of their own mortality." "You've met them before?" Vethled continued. Mordriver nodded and put down the rag. "A few years in my years. None with us now, of course. Not for a while." He looked over at Niren, whose eyes were still bright with fear. "You worry too much, little master. Humans are not like those you found in your nursery stories. They are, for the most part, trustworthy, so long as their purses are kept full and they get their share of the spoils after. A night in the dark will sober his bloodlust, and in the morning he'll talk." Niren shivered. "Did you say the way he looked at us?" Mordriver turned away, but leaned his head slightly towards Vethled. "The young are not meant to see these things." He looked knowingly. Vethled nodded and turned to Niren, smiling with his arms wide, guiding him out of the barracks. "Come on, let's get you back to the keep and warm you up. I'm sure I saw some sugar biscuits in the kitchen yesterday. Let's get you one of those." They emerged together, filing across the snow-swept courtyard and up the steps to the keep.